Salutations, ladies and gentlemen, the Knife Raven here, back again with another video, and it's been a while, but I am returning today to bring you a knife from Arthur Wright once again. Now, a while back, I took a look at this, which was a very interesting pruner, and I spoke fairly highly of it. I thought that there were definitely some areas where there could be room for improvement, but overall it was a very nice knife for the price. With that order, I got one other knife from Arthur Wright. Now, this was from Heine Haynes a while back, and this is definitely the nicer of the two, and you can be the judge of that yourself, but I personally am quite smitten with this. The knife in question is a Spearpoint, and it's the first time I've ever had an Arthur Wright knife in Stag. Yes, this is the Wright Son Spearpoint, or as some may also call it, a teardrop, a boy's knife, depending really on what your personal definition is, but they call this their Spearpoint. And it's in some natural stag. Now, I don't have much when it comes to stag in my collection. I have a few pieces with me. I'm pretty sure there's an old kissing crane that I have to dig out, but here are some of the highlights. This is a Stockman from Cat's Knives. This is a Slimline from Groman, and this is, in my opinion, the nicest bit of stag I have on a knife. And this is a very interesting piece that has no name attached to it, and I have no idea where it's even made, but it was a knife I found at a small market. And here you are. Nice bit of stag. But again, don't really know about that last one, but you have Canadian made, Sheffield made, and made in Japan. But all nice pieces of stag. I definitely say that this one doesn't stand out as particularly spectacular in comparison to them, but that doesn't mean it's bad by any means. It's just, I think, something like this just tends to stand out a little bit more. But enough about those for now. Here is the knife, and the quality on this is very, very good. Now, the Stag cost this knife about 41-ish pounds, I believe. Now, that is a bit higher up in the price range for an Arthur Wright knife, as the pruner here with ebony cost around 30, so it's going to be a bit of a step up. But bear in mind, Stag isn't exactly a cheap material, and because of that, it did cost a bit more. But 40 pounds for a knife of this quality is still very reasonable. Speaking of which, how is the quality? Well, we'll look at the back for starters. You have brass liners and a carbon spring, as always on Arthur Wright knives. If my camera would be so kind as to focus, thank you. You can see that it's a very clean back. There's no real gapping to speak of. I could make an argument it looks like there's a very small gap there. But again, doing the light test, nothing shines through. So if you want to be nitpicky about that, it's only a cosmetic gap. It won't actually affect the knife in any way. But very clean back overall. Very well done. The bolsters are polished nickel silver. Again, trademark for Arthur Wright, I'd say. Very typical. The transitions on stag knives are very hard to get right, as stag is a natural material that swells and shrinks with moisture and the temperature. And because of that, sometimes it's hard to properly align and keep aligned, but this is very good. I'd say you can definitely feel the difference in material, as one is metal and one is bone, but it's still a very smooth transition. There's nothing bumpy about it or anything to catch on. Same can be said on this side. Very, very smooth overall. The grind on these bolsters is very even, and I think it's very well done there. Blade centering is very, very good, but not perfect. It's a little bit off to the right. Can I correct it myself? Doesn't look like it. Although, again, I've said before, while I'd like the knife to be perfectly centered, as long as it's not rubbing, I'm not going to be too harsh on it, particularly at this price point. One thing you might have already seen, the Stag does make this knife look a little bit uneven. And that is a typical thing with Stag, being a natural material again, where the shape is always going to vary. You can see that if you want perfect evenness, you might want to look elsewhere, as this Stag is fairly fluid in its pattern. I'd say that's definitely not the same with, say, this bit of ebony here. But again, personally, I appreciate that fact in Stag. It makes the knife look very rustic, very handmade, as if there's no real machining involved. And for the most part, these are all very true facts. Arthur Wright, again, uses mostly hand labor. They have a couple old machines around the factory, but from what I know, these are as close to true handmade knives as you can get. But nail nick is very well ground. You can sort of almost get a grip to pinch this, but unfortunately, this is mostly a nail nick open knife. No half stop on this one. The blade is a Spearpoint, of course. Actually get some of that oil off. But a Spearpoint blade, as you can see here, which is typical of a boy's knife, often seen on a teardrop such as this. It's a very recognizable style of knife as a whole, I'd say. But the tang stamp, this is the older tang stamp, a Wright Son Limited, Sheffield, England. You can see it very clearly, but you will have to fold it halfway to fully be able to read England. Although I will say this is better than some of them, where you've had to fold it halfway and even then you can barely read the tang. So very clear printing there, if you ask me. No blade play on this whatsoever. That's one thing I can't criticize Arthur Wright on. I almost never get blade play from them. And if I do, it's been extremely minimal. The grind is a flat grind. And as for the edge, I definitely say that Arthur Wright as a whole is beginning to actually sharpen their knives. Now I know that seems a bit unnecessary to say for most, but for those who aren't used to Arthur Wright, their knives typically come less than what would be appropriately sharp from the factory. And generally you have to touch them up yourself, which is a bit of a nuisance, as frankly, a knife should be able to cut when new. And granted, yes, you should know how to sharpen one, but that doesn't mean you should have to, especially when the knife is new. But this is getting a bit better. I still wouldn't say this is using sharp. I wouldn't want to carry this probably and put it through much use more than just opening a letter or maybe a box, but could use for a touch-up, but better than before. Again, it is C70 Carbon steel. Again, easy to sharpen, doesn't hold an edge for terribly long, and doesn't really have any resistance to rust or corrosion. Warping in the edge is non-existent by where I can see. And the grip on this knife is very comfortable. You have a full 4 fingers on the knife, and that's just on the handle, but you can choke up with the bit of the extended tang there and get a very, very nice grip. I will say, I personally am a bit more biased to using my left hand when it comes to knives, but this knife really does do better off there, as the way the Stag is ground, you can see there's a bit of a bulge in the side here, this bit of, I suppose, a valley here, and it makes for a very, very snug fit, particularly in the left hand. So, very comfortable knife for me, for someone who prefers their right hand. I don't know if I can say the same. Do a quick measurement here. We have a total of, I believe, just over 6 1/4, just a tad bit under 6 1/2 inches overall. The blade is coming in just over 2 3/4, and the cutting edge is coming in just at 2 1/2. So, very much UK legal by the looks of it. and that would be expected with a knife like this. It's a slip joint again, no lock on it whatsoever. The transition also from the spring to the blade is fairly good, very smooth again. And as for the tension, this is not a knife you'll have to be afraid of closing on you. I would say, compared to my other Arthur Wright Spearpoint, this is a very nice action. I would like to take a second to talk about that. Despite being incapable of pinching this knife open, which is something I personally prefer on a knife, the action is very much reasonable. I would say that in terms of opening, it would come in at a solid 8, and probably for closing, maybe a 7. Compared to my other Arthur Wright Spearpoint, which was decidedly worse in terms of overall fit and finish. How so? Well, starting with the considerably worse blade centering, the gap that runs through the rosewood and between the liner, which is quite ugly, and the fact that this knife I may not actually be able to open on camera. Okay, I got lucky today. Yes, this is still, even after it's been around for a few months and I've tried to break it in, this is still an easy 9 bordering on a 10. This is a strong, strong spring, and when I open it, I have to open it part way with the nail nick and then pinch it open the rest of the way, because if I open this with my nail in that nail nick, it will absolutely break. And that isn't something I would like to have to do. But yes, this is a knife that is not particularly comfortable to open. This one, I'd say, is. You can definitely get it open with a lot more ease, and it's just a more comfortable action as a whole. This knife was a bit more, I think this was an older production from what I can guess, again based on the fit and finish itself. This was a recent knife that was sold at Heine Haynes. Again, this was a batch they received, I believe, in December of 2023. I purchased it, I believe, February, early February. This knife was bought at Steel City Cutlery, and I don't know how long they'd had this knife in for, but this one I bought in November. So, possibly a newer knife, I'm assuming fairly new production. So, if that's going to be a standpoint for what you can expect from here on out, I think that's a very good thing. I do still like the look of this knife, but in terms of its execution, I can't say it's on the same level as this. But I'll just take that away and do a couple comparisons with some other Spearpoint style knives I have on hand. Here it is with a couple Ottermessers. This one is the Wenge Taschenmesser. And you can see the size is fairly similar. The Otter is a bit smaller overall. The cutting edge, I'd say, is, well, still a bit shorter. But these are very similar in terms of overall size. Of course, the Otter, however, my main complaint with this, there's nothing to complain about when it comes to fit and finish or materials. However, this knife was very, very pricey for what it is. The quality on this is better than that. I'd say it's more refined, everything's smoother. The blade definitely came sharper. However, the price on this was sitting in at around 160 Canadian, whereas this would probably run you 60-ish Canadian. So either Arthur Wright is grossly underpricing their knives and making almost no money on them, or Ottermesser is vastly overpricing. One or the other, because that's a very big difference. And granted, you could argue that the Wenge would elevate this one a little bit higher, but Stag isn't a cheap material in and of itself, so there's a bit of an issue there. I still like this knife, but quite overpriced. Here it is with another Ottermesser. This one was considerably less expensive, sitting in at around 100 Canadian. This one is the Dry Nietenmesser, also known as the 3-rivet knife. Very oily carbon blade. Again, you have the blackwood handles on this one, and this is quite a large knife. As you can see, it dwarfs the Arthur Wright in handle and blade size as a whole. This one is not UK legal based on what I would assume, and so would not recommend this one for everyday carry, but this one should be okay. I'd say that the quality on this one was a little bit less refined than on this model, but still, considering this would cost you $100 and this would cost you $160, and this one would be between 60 and maybe 80 on the high end, it's a little bit ridiculous looking at that one. And then, of course, I'll bring back the other Arthur Wright. So, 2 Otter Messers, 2 Arthur Wrights. Easily the worst in terms of fit and finish, but this one probably cost, I think, around £33, so cheaper than this one, but still, the fit and finish did suffer a bit. But there you are, 4 Spearpoints from 2 makers, and fairly impressed with them, well, except maybe for this one. Back to the Arthur Wright, the original one. This is a very nice knife, and I think that the Stag, again, it's not the nicest Stag I have ever seen. It's very, I'd say, grayscale. That's the first thing I think of when I look at this. It's very barren. It's lacking any extra coloration beyond just black, white, and a bit of gray. But I'd still say it's very rustic. Has a nice appeal to it. Me personally, I do prefer Stag like this, with a bit more of that coffee brown and almost that red in certain areas. But again, personal preference. Not to say that this is by any means a bad knife. So what are my thoughts on this? Well, I definitely like it more than the Rosewood model. I'd say that for maybe 9 or 10 pounds more, getting the Stag and also having much nicer fit and finish, this knife was not one that I regret purchasing. It was not the only knife in that order. There was, of course, the peach pruner and a couple other knives that I have yet to review. But I'd say that it was probably one of the nicest of the bunch. Now, I believe Heine Haynes did sell the last one about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So unfortunately, you will not be able to order one of these immediately, but they do restock every once in a while, so keep an eye out if you want one of these. I think that in terms of overall price, Heine Haynes does sell Arthur Wright knives for the lowest rates that I have seen. Again, this, the peach pruner, and a few other knives that I have purchased from Arthur Wright have been sold at Heine Haynes, so I'd recommend them as a seller. They have a pretty good selection. But again, this is a fairly consistent knife, and I'd say for the price, it's definitely a worthy contender to the likes of Case. In fact, I'd almost say that it would overtake Case in terms of quality to price ratio, as a Case knife in this material would probably run you maybe 120, 130 Canadian. And at that point, you're within the realm of the overpriced Otter Messer. But very nice knife. I'd give it a solid 8 out of 10. Again, not the most refined in the world. You could still make arguments about the blade centering, the cutoff of the spring, how sharp it is. But to me, this is still a very nice knife. It feels like an artisan product, which it is. And as a whole, I'm very happy with it. So, there you are. Arthur Wright & Son Spearpoint / boy's knife / Teardrop Jack in Staghorn. And this is the Knife Raven, as always, signing off. Goodbye.